And welcome. We have an awesome lineup today. We're really excited about it. And there's a lot of opportunities, both for networking as well as asking questions and engaging with our speakers. So I encourage you to do that. Couple quick housekeeping items before we get into our opening session. So with that, I will kind of go through those. Let's see if the clicker would, there we go. On that note, the Q&A program, so if you've been to our conferences before, it's the same deal. If you're new, couple quick comments on that. You could go to the URL gtm.cnf.io from any device, and there you'll be able to essentially see the agenda, click on an agenda item or a session, if you will, and pose questions within that. Those questions will feed into an iPad that's on stage, and essentially that's a way to basically pose your question to the speaker. You're also able to upvote questions, so if you see questions you like or a topic of conversation you really want to be sort of fostered further, that's your opportunity to do so. So gtm.cnf.io, it'll be at the bottom of the screens the entire time, but just note that. We wanted to note that there is a special offer for GTM Squared, so that is our sort of, that is our deeper analysis and further kind of article sort of discovery, if you will, on our website. So GTM Squared, great opportunity to learn more. Our reporters dive into policy and other related questions in a lot more detail. And if you join by September 30th and use the promo code REV17, you'll be able to take an additional 100% off annual membership, which is a pretty good deal. So just wanted to offer that to folks. And then I think probably second to last before we get into the discussion is this is kind of a listing of our upcoming events across sort of the US and even Mexico. So feel free to take note of those and use discount code alumni for registration if you're interested. And then with that, I'd like to introduce Nilda Mesa, who is the Director of Urban Sustainability and Equity Planning at the Urban Design Lab. So welcome, Nilda. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Nice to have you here. And I guess to open us up, what I think was interesting is setting the context that we're here in New York City, and this is the New York Rev Conference, and I know you have a background in kind of working in sustainability for the city. Maybe kind of ground us in sort of generally your thoughts on the kind of role of cities, and in particular New York, in terms of meeting distributed energy and sustainability goals.
Great. So thanks for having me here. It's great to be here, and looking forward to the rest of the program as well, which looks terrific. So when I was at the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, I was director under Mayor de Blasio, we looked very carefully at how do we reduce our carbon emissions as a city, and we looked also at, as you can imagine, state and then federal goals on how to do that, and what was it in particular that we could do within the city and in conjunction with everybody else. So some of the things that we found were that more or less, it changes from year to year, but more or less 70% or so of greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings in New York City. Around 20% or so come from transportation, and about 7% or so comes from waste. And when I say buildings, that incorporates energy that is going into buildings, as well as the building systems themselves and how buildings are designed. And one of the things that we found was also that New York City makes up something like 40% of New York State's greenhouse gas emissions. So in order for New York State and New York City to succeed in their goals to reduce carbon and become more energy efficient, they really have to be aligned, which luckily on policy, in this area, people pretty much are, which is great. And so some of the things that we found were that as far as buildings go, electricity is a very important part, and the cleanness of the electricity that's going into the buildings is very important. But in addition, are thermal. So is thermal, like heat and hot water. And in fact, for residential in particular, that makes up an even greater share of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's something that has to be considered in this mix. Another thing is that, as everybody here knows, that the distribution systems at the grid is quite old in New York State, and the city has been growing. There are challenges when it comes to capacity and so forth. But I think in order to solve these challenges that are coming up that are here, it's necessary to look at everything from the grid to buildings and how they operate, to bringing in more renewables. At that time, something like 2-3% of New York City's grid was coming, or electric grid was coming from renewable sources. That's not including nuclear. And so to the extent that renewables can be deployed in a way that they feed into the city, that's really probably like one of your fastest pathways to reducing carbon emissions. So like the development of offshore wind off of Long Island is very promising. Development of additional wind resources, but bringing them from upstate to downstate, or from western part of New York State to the city is going to be important, as opposed to sort of developing recs that are out of state that on paper maybe can make a difference. And the other piece of that is the equity piece, because it's the same fuels that create the carbon emissions that also create air pollution. And so it's some of our poorest neighborhoods that have some of the worst air quality in the U.S. And that has this ripple effect, because if you've got and if you've got kids who are calling in sick to school who are in the poorer neighborhoods because of asthma, which is in fact like the biggest reason that kids call in sick to school, that often will mean that some caregiver is going to have to stay home with the kid, which means that they're not going to work. Right. They have to call in sick, or you've got some senior who's got respiratory issues, and it's being amplified by air pollution. Then you've got again others. So there's this tremendous ripple effect that isn't just about reducing carbon emissions. It's much broader than that.
So great. So I think there's a couple of things to sort of unpack, I guess, in that summary. And one of the first things that jumped to mind is sort of alignment between the city and state seems to be kind of in existence in terms of overall goals, but where I think the folks see not necessarily a gap, but more opportunity for structures around kind of, the goals are there, and sort of how we get there is sort of up for debate or still in question. I think Rev kind of sets a bit of a context for that, but there's still a lot of opportunity. So on that alignment, I mean, do we have enough? Is there enough structure around things such as energy storage, if you will, or other kind of areas where you see opportunity for buildings to become more kind of active distributed energy assets, if you will?
Yeah, I think we're still in early days on this. And energy storage is going to be incredibly crucial to figuring out how we move forward on this. And, it's true of New York City, it's true of other places. So, in particular in New York City, FDNY has some very legitimate, very real concerns about safety and battery storage in close proximity to densely populated, buildings. And so I think those things need to get worked out, but it's going to take a bit of time. But I don't think you're going to be able to see the kind of flexibility that we need, the kind of redundancy, the resiliency that we need, unless the energy storage piece gets developed more.
Not to jump to an audience question, but it's very germane to the conversation we're having right now. I mean, furthering on that comment, is there anything that New York City can actually do from a policy and or other perspective to either move REV faster and or incent sort of distributed energy deployments to happen in a more escalated timeline?
I don't know about moving REV faster. It's a state, process. The city's been very involved in it. There have been people sort of throughout who've been participating in, different work groups, and the city's, worked pretty closely with the utilities as well on this and participates actively in all of the rate cases. And I don't know that there's much can do to speed up on that. But as far as, building codes and so forth, that would be an area where I could see the city, doing more. And there are pilot, the city can test out things, so there are different pilot projects that, have popped up, which I think have provided the kind of information that you need in order to get, good sound policy coming out of it. But that's kind of what I would see coming up more in the near future.
Sure. And then I think the second sort of thing to unpack from your opener, which I think is relevant, is around kind of renewables and meeting either renewable targets or getting more renewable energy into the mix. So from that perspective, I mean, you mentioned Long Island and offshore wind and some other sort of opportunities upstate for renewables. Are we on a path to actually meet New York City's renewable energy goals by 2030? And if we're not, or if there's more that we could be doing, who is the right person to help animate markets to kind of get that done, whether within a REV context or outside of it?
That's a really good question. I think one area that has not been looked at so much is like geothermal, and that I think has tremendous potential, in fact, in New York City, but it's difficult. I think that when it comes to solar, that there's a lot going on now, but it's not enough yet, and I think that may take off. I think like what Westchester County is doing with community choice aggregation is a really productive step in that direction, and I would hope to see more of that, throughout the state and maybe someday in the city as well. But it just seems like, when it comes, for example, when it comes to buildings, I mean, I tend to think of energy efficiency as almost like a renewable source, in some ways even better than renewable, because it's, the greenest electron is the one that's not used. And so it's something that has a lot of potential, but the structure for financing things isn't really quite there yet. And that's what for some larger scale projects, yeah, but that's what I would hope to see in the next few years, and maybe pathways so that the two parties, the folks who are actually behind the carbon emission reduction goals and the financing people, can start to understand each other's language perhaps a bit more. And I see this as somebody who's like immigrant kids, so I'm always thinking about terms of like different languages, but I think that's a vital thing, and I think that there's a lot of potential there that just hasn't been met yet.
Right. Yeah, I think project finance for some of these technologies has been challenging because of the bankability of it. And so I think that's a good topic, which we'll dive into a little bit more. One other sort of comment I thought that was interesting was around kind of LMI, low to medium income folks, and the sort of importance of that. And we have a session later today that's specifically, or it might even be tomorrow, that's specifically focused on that sort of constituency from a customer perspective and how they impact distributed energy. But 2.3 folks in New York City alone are kind of qualify for LMIs as it sort of relates to energy and all that. What could the industry, I guess, be doing? And you have folks in the room from a policy perspective. You also have folks who are kind of technology innovators and distributed energy resource providers in thinking about sort of that market, and also trying to figure out how to sort of either make money or scale to make some sort of achieve the goals necessary. I mean, what do you see from that perspective in terms of customer engagement and customer kind of education?
I know that there are churches, for example, in Harlem and other neighborhoods that are beginning to work with their congregations to try to figure out this. I think the best idea in some places is just to go through like what are the strong community organizations that already have the networks and work with those. Again, I think a lot of it is a financing issue. If PACE comes into being, I think that may actually really help things. I think one of the issues has been that you can't carry forward the investments, beyond a certain amount of time. And and to look at these investments, if they all have to meet like a 5-year ROI, then that makes it much more challenging to put in. Technologies like blockchain, I think, could be really innovative and could be really productive in this space. But it's, I don't think that it's a matter of lack of demand, in LMI communities or amongst people who are LMI. I think it's more a matter of like people don't necessarily have the time and the resources to figure out like how do you solve these complicated issues. So to the extent that those things can be figured out, the templates can be built, that then can be worked out with a community, then I think it holds tremendous potential.
Great. Kind of two more questions, and then we'll start to go through some from the audience. But immediately after the session is kind of a policy debate on kind of, has Rev to date stimulated markets? And in particular, what is the changing role of the utility, and how should or should not the utility be involved moving forward? Any thoughts on kind of, your perspective on how you see the role of utilities as it relates to kind of animating markets in New York, and in particular, any specific thoughts on New York City as it relates to, Con Ed and others who, arguably could just be a network manager, could own distributed energy resource assets, or some sort of combination still to be determined.
Yeah, I think it's early days, but I do think that utilities are incredibly important to figuring out these these issues. We worked pretty closely with the utilities, and sometimes on the same side, and sometimes not so much on the same side. And I think that what you see going on with between the rate cases and everything else that's coming up before the PSC, I think that's the opportunity, and it would be. I think that there's potential within those kinds of structures to work things out. Competition and new technologies, I think, are healthy for this. I think that there have been people who've been used to doing things in a particular way for decades. There have been institutions used to doing things in a particular way for decades, and that's all changing now. That's all being broken up now. And so it's forcing folks to really take a hard, deep look at how they can be doing things differently. And it's encouraging, actually, to see that that kind of thinking is making its way through in the utilities.
Great. And then another session, I'm just curious, or either comments on, or what you would like to see from sort of where you sit, both from a post-city, I guess, perspective, as well as at Columbia, is in our afternoon keynote with Richard Kaufman. I think one of the things that's really particularly interesting about New York is sort of the leadership that the state, and to a certain extent the city, has taken post sort of the Paris talks and kind of moving that forward regardless of federal support or federal kind of guidance around that. Can you kind of just speak about sort of, do you agree with that? How should that work, and how can kind of cities and states kind of be as powerful, if not more powerful, than the federal government in kind of moving goals forward?
I actually think that cities and states are incredibly powerful in this, and I think that to a great degree, the decisions that are made locally are really the ones that have an impact, whether it's at the utility level, the state level, the city level. When it comes to, it can be anything from building codes to again PSC cases that are going on. There are some very healthy and robust networks of cities, city organizations, as well as states. There are subnational initiatives that I think have been really constructive. That are some of them are perhaps more in the infant stage than others. But if you're looking at things like the Under 2 Coalition, if you're looking at things like C40, Climate Neutral Cities Alliance, cities learn from each other, and there's a healthy and friendly competition amongst cities and amongst states as well. And so what you'll find is that large cities, mid-sized, small cities will all be looking at each other and saying, like, wait, how did you pull that off? What can we steal from you? What can we do? And that is incredibly dynamic, and that doesn't really have much to do with the federal government per se, but it has to do with everybody kind of recognizing that at the local level, these are really important issues that need to be resolved, and people are calling for them to be resolved. And there's a little there's a little bragging rights that go with it. So and I think New York City has been seen as a leader in this, amongst other cities, amongst peers for a while now. If you're looking at things like the Building Technical Work, which has a horrible title, but the Building Technical Working Group report looking at buildings, I take full responsibility for the horrible title, but it's under my watch. But if you're looking at that kind of analysis, that kind of like deep sort of core look at what is it, let's pick this apart, what is it that really needs to get done, that's what is important. And when we put it out, other cities looked at it and were like, whoa, let's see what we can learn from this, and we do the same with them. So the federal level, what's kind of a shame is that under the previous administration, they were really good at, really quite good at convening cities in certain ways, in certain fora, so that you could kind of move things forward. So now cities have to do it, again, on their own. But until, frankly, the last few years of the Obama administration, they hadn't been doing that much either. So cities and states actually have a pretty good level of experience, which hadn't gotten all that much attention before, at doing this. So, and I think it's only gotten stronger.
Great. We'll move to some kind of questions that are coming in from the audience, and I would summarize the general theme of a number of these around kind of great, and now let's bring it back to sort of a rev context, which I totally appreciate. So is there, and I kind of asked this question, but I might ask it a bit of a different way to get at, I think, what folks are kind of asking, which is around, what can New York City actually do, if anything, to make rev move faster, and in particular, kind of, help create sort of a market for innovators and technology providers to kind of prove out some concepts or prove out some business models, and sort of two, where are the material impacts of, can rev really drive the material impacts that are needed around greenhouse gas emissions? Like, are the two linked, and if so, sort of what is that link, or where do you potentially see that link moving forward?
I mean, I totally see rev driving impacts on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah. I think it's critical in order to reduce it for the state, and I think that the interplay between state and city, and not just New York City but other cities, right, within New York State and the counties and stuff is critically important. I'm not sure what the city can do to move things forward faster in rev, because it's a state process. But the city does have active incubators. There are active sort of coalitions within different boroughs that are proposing and getting approvals for like pilot projects or different kinds of ways to prove out concepts. And so I would think that that's actually one of the strongest things that can happen, because you can do that here. But there's still a lot that hasn't been tested. There's still a lot that needs to be proven out. But the city can have a role to play in that.
Great. And kind of furthering on that comment, one of the big ways in which you could potentially, or one could potentially kind of impact sort of change is around rates. And so I don't know if you've looked at, from either your work at Columbia or elsewhere, kind of the impact of rates and innovation in rates and how that might affect sort of change quicker. Do you have any kind of comments around sort of how New York is progressing in terms of potentially getting more dynamic with rates as a function of opening up markets? What does that look like? Have you seen sort of an example of innovation rates driving change forward faster in other places, in other geographies that we should take note? Or is it still kind of TBD?
I think it's a little bit TBD, but I think that there's a lot of potential there for innovation. We would comment pretty regularly on the rate cases, and it was our mantra was, and this has been true of New York City for a long time. The mantra is pretty much like it needs to be reliable, affordable, and we added and clean energy to that. And so I think that there is potential there. It's just I don't think it's been fully developed yet.
Great. In terms of short-term priorities for REV, and some of the priorities listed are energy efficiency or capital efficiency, which kind of talks about sort of the financing issue we mentioned earlier, or emissions efficiency. Like, what do you see as the top 1, 2, 3 priorities of REV over the next 2-3 years to kind of get us from sort of the structure we've created to actually markets that are moving?
I mean, they're all important. I don't know. I want to say all of the above, because I don't think that we know enough yet in each of these to say like, oh yeah, here's the golden bullet. I don't think there is a golden bullet, and I think it's going to be the combination of these depending on the area that's going to, move things forward. I do think that buildings, there's a lot of potential there, and that's something that can be, brought in some ways sooner, but in other ways, that depends as well on, the financing. I think development of renewables is going to take some time, just because it usually does, except for something like solar, but, to get that to scale is also going to take time. So, I guess I would say 1 and 2 together, okay, in a way.
To that note on solar, and you mentioned this earlier, there was a question around the role of solar thermal or solar heating and cooling technologies, and how that plays a role in REV and GHG. And I think New York in particular and the city in particular have more opportunities than other sort of geographies around solar thermal. So maybe you could kind of dive in a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, in a densely populated place like New York, you're going to have more opportunities for solar thermal. And it's also, then that gets to, the heat and hot water issue as well, which is important for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in, New York, which has such a big proportion coming from that.
Great. And let's see, what other questions? Around sort of DER deployment just in general in New York, it sounds like, what I'm hearing, it sounds like energy storage is one of the biggest question marks out there in terms of kind of where sort of regulation and policy direction going? Are we going to start to become a bit more of a California in terms of having kind of much broader incentives for energy storage? Can we sort of resolve the issues as it relates to deployment locally with either the city or FDNY, what have you? Is energy storage kind of one of the main things to unlock as it relates to moving that forward, or what other barriers do you see as potential inhibitors for? Yeah,
I think energy storage is definitely one of the big things, and I think it also helps with resiliency. I think it helps with, I think it helps with like, potentially affordability, but certainly with reliability for the grid. I think that having that there as a a redundant kind of an asset is really important for the system, but also, if the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine,
right,
as everybody says, and you need to have something to capture that and sort of take care of, some of the periods where you don't have those electrons coming in. So.
Right. Well, great. I think with that, we're at time. We touched on a lot of topics that I think are super important from the city's perspective, but also those that we're going to be diving into in more detail in later sessions. So, first of all, a big thank you to Nilda for joining us this morning. So thanks.
Thank you.
And with that.